The work I'm going to show you is part of a project that has been financed both by Total and the French Geological Survey. And this is something I have done with my colleague Dominique Chardon. So I'm going to give you some results that we have on the evolution of the relief related to the Equatorial Atlantic opening. And I'm going to concentrate on the northern part of South America. The general question we address is actually the evolution of the relief of the continent, but at geological time scale. And so if you want to do that, you have to work on sediment routing system that produce sediment by eroding the relief, store them more or less transiently on the continent, and then reaching the ocean. And these systems are super sensitive to the deformation of the lithosphere. And generally, they are mostly studied in orogenic domain because that's where, well, the action is. And there are large vertical motion to alter them. But the anorogenic domain and the cratonic domain are also important in terms of volume reaching the ocean, even if it's more slow. And all these erosion, weatheric transit, storage, accumulation process are highly sensitive to thinning and flexure of the lithosphere, and even sometimes to mantle support. So this is the general framework of the work I'm going to show you. And the area we have studied is the Atlantic margin of the Guyana Shield, where you have two basins, the Guyana-Suriname basin and the Foz basin, basically where the delta of the Amazon is, and they are separated by the Demerara Plateau. And they are under the influence of the Andes and also the Caribbean subduction zone. So to study this area, we had access to a very, very dense seismic reflection data set covering both basin and the Demerara and some wells. And so it's within the green dashed line. And it is a fairly complex margin because it's been formed actually in two steps. The first steps that correspond to the southern tip of the Central Atlantic has generated Jurassic oceanic crust. It's called that's the Guyana-Suriname basin. And later on, in the Cretaceous, in the Cretaceous, the rest of the equatorial part of the margin formed when the Equatorial Atlantic opened as a very oblique rift, as you can see here, the en echelon system. As a result of this obliquity and superimposition, the margin shows alternating segments that are transformed or divergent and sometimes oblique here. And there is a big difference between the dynamic of the Guyana-Suriname basin and the Atlantic margin. And I'm going to show you a section running across the two domains. You see here the section across the Demerara Plateau, this thick chunk of continental crust. You see the rifting of the Atlantic here that has a very thick thin rift deposit, which are actually a part or totally volcanics. And the stretching is associated with ductile deformation and in the lower crust and is very wide. While the Equatorial Atlantic part of the margin is much thinner, much less ductile deformation, and a much more narrow margin. So to schematize this, you can see across the Demerara the influence of the Central Atlantic Rift, a magma-rich margin, and the Equatorial Atlantic Rift, which is a narrow oblique margin. That are superimposed in space and time. So to further study this margin, we used the stratigraphic architecture of the sedimentary basin to record the accumulation history that I'm going to show you. So what we did is we built a sediment thickness map since the Jurassic that allows us to calculate accumulation rates through time. And what we also did is build paleogeographic maps of the main lithology deposited. So basically you have all the sandy, rich and sand deposit in yellow and the more clay dominated deposit in green and the carbonate in blue. So I'm going to go through the history of this opening. So basically, as I told you at the beginning, the southern tip of the Central Atlantic, it forms a very thick basin. You see here the volume associated to it. Just keep in mind it's mostly volcanic. And then immediately after the breakup, you have a very low volume of sediment that is deposited. So probably if there was relief associated to that ridge, it was completely eroded away. And this allows for the development of a large carbonate platform that you have here. After that, you have the stage where you open the Equatorial Atlantic here. And you see that the volume now is deposited both in the Guyana-Suriname Basin and Fosse Basin. It's much thinner than the Central Atlantic Seine Rift. And as a difference, after the breakup, the amount of sediment is increasing in the Fosse Basin. It's not completely reduced like for the Central Atlantic Rift. And it's really dominated by clastic deposit, thicker sandy deposit for a very long time. And you have a completely different behavior in the Fosse Basin where the amount of sediment is increasing through time, while in the Guyana-Suriname Basin, it's decreasing through time. After that, we think that the relief of the rift are completely eroded away because again, you drop the siliciclastic deposit and you develop a new carbonate platform. And it's remained that way until, let's say, the last 5-6 million years, where the sediment supplies increase a lot. And that's because that's the time where you install the present-day drainage of the Orinoco and the Amazon, which is a very, very big system, and you renew the siliciclastic deposition at the time. So to summarize, you go from a period where you have a magma-rich margin, probably associated with maybe some relief, but very reduced, because immediately after breakup, you are able to install the carbonate platform. Then you install the Equatorial Atlantic Rift, and probably the relief were much higher because you renew the siliciclastic supplies, not only in the Fosse Basin, but also in the Guyana-Suriname, and you sustain this siliciclastic deposit all along the upper Cretaceous, late Cretaceous. Then after that, you have a long period during the Cenozoic where you have almost no sedimentary supply, a lot of weathering on the continent, I'll get back to that, and a carbonate platform before the installation of the present day drainage of the Amazon Orinoco. So you have a very different behavior between the Central Atlantic Rift here and the Equatorial Atlantic Rift in terms of relief. So this is another way to look at the result through time now, the two carbonate platform, and then the increase of sediment during the upper Cretaceous associated with the late history of the Equatorial Rift, the diminution and the increase in the late Pliocene, So to look at what's happening in the source of this system, we use data acquired by colleagues that dated the denudation, the weathering surface on the continent, and they show that this surface were actually associated with a weathering that was as old as 50 million years. It means that since 50 million years, there was very little denudation on the craton. And also the low temperature thermal chronology of Derrick et al. Sorry, I forgot to put the reference, show that there's been some denudation and cooling during the Equatorial Rift, but nothing since 100 million years. And we also made some paleogeographic map of the sediment routing system that I don't have the time to show you. But if you use all this information, you can draw a source to sink description of the system, where you go from the source are in the Jurassic, the erosion of the Central Atlantic rift-related relief, but that are eroded away very fast. Then the the Equatorial Atlantic rift-related relief that are sustained almost throughout the Cretaceous. And then during a major part of the Cenozoic, the sedimentation is driven by the fact that we have a lot of weathering on the continent. So all the sediment production is stored in the regolites on the craton and never reach the margin. And it is only when you install the transcontinental drainage tapping sediment in the Andes, feeding the margin through the Orinoco and the Amazon, that you increase the siliciclastic accumulation rate again.
You had 10 minutes now.
Okay, so just to summarize and go back to the initial question, we think that what's interesting here in this study is that you can safely say that this craton has been actually eroded super slowly, super steadily and homogeneously during at least 100 million years. So that's something you can use as a reference. It has been impacted, of course, by the creation of the rift-related relief during the Equatorial. But what you can say is that because you observe a very important spatial and temporal variability of the accumulation on the margin, then you know that these variations are more controlled by climate, like weathering or drainage reorganization, rather than vertical movement of the craton. So just to point out that the craton has have a very different behavior than the orogen in terms of routing system and controlling parameters. That's it. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Delphine. So does anybody have questions? You can type them in the chat or raise your hand. Or have maybe time for one question. Otherwise,
I can put my... I think Jean has a question.
To the end. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Jean. Hello.
Oh, Delphine, nice talk. Really interesting.
Thank you.
I have a question about if you can put your slide 24, it'll be easier.
This one?
Yeah, I was wondering, what is your evidence to stop the thermal cooling in the southern part to such a short period?
In the Equatorial Atlantic?
Yeah, well, you still have a lot of sediments coming in, so there must be some accommodation space, or is a progradation mostly that makes you think there was little subsidence?
No, it's okay. Sorry. This is maybe a little abusive saying there's no subsidence in the margin. What I meant it's the tectonically driven subsidence. So obviously, you still have subsidence associated to the load of the sediment, and of course probably still some thermal subsidence, but it's really reduced compared to what you have before that. And the reason why I'm saying that, it's because you really see the depositional center associated to some drainage. So somehow you can say that it's mostly the drainage, the continental drainage, deciding where the sediment are going rather than the homogeneous subsidence. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.